The beginning of this chapter starts with the election of 1960, where John Kennedy became the youngest president in American history. Sadly, the public did not prioritize solving issues of poverty or racial discrimination at this time. There was tax incentives to employers to hire certain workers, affirmative action, the development of the national welfare system, and redistributive tax reform, but this did not help with their immediate economic needs. The shift in public opinion began when segregation was being challenged by the bus boycotts and the murder of Emmett Till in the summer of 1955 that outraged the nation. The civil rights movement and public opinion forced Kennedy to propose civil rights legislation in 1963, which led to wins like the desegregation of bus and train stations, the ban of job discrimination on race and gender, and ending discrimination in voter registration. There was also the Manpower Development and Training Act of 1962 that was passed, allowing 600,000 workers to complete technical training by 1968, but there was a lot of problems with the program, with people dropping out, the skills not being needed by the local job market, and relocation assistance being limited. There was also the Action of Mental Health that was issued in 1961 that recommended federal funding of community-based mental health services. When Kennedy died, many of his policies proposals were making their way through the legislative process, but he was not able to defend them due to his assassination.
So, as most of you probably know, Lyndon B. Johnson was Kennedy's successor. He was a very successful president and was actually reelected after being appointed president because of Kennedy's assassination. So, because of that, you can just assume he had a lot of skills that were beneficial. He was very different than Kennedy, and he kind of had more ambition towards a lot of things. This also went hand in hand with his gluttony. So he was very gluttonous president, and this could be seen through a lot of the decisions and policies that he had. The chapter highlights 3 of these. The first was a large tax cut that was drafted by the Kennedy's administration, but following the assassination, it wasn't a very smart decision to go through with. Johnson still wanted to go through with it. He kind of went full force through everything he wanted to improve a lot of stuff, so he went through with it and didn't think about the consequences of his administration. It didn't do what it was supposed to do, and both liberals and conservatives were unhappy. Another time that he bit off more than he can chew, he took over Kennedy's, obviously, responsibilities in Vietnam at the time. After Vietnam started a civil war, Kennedy decided to not send any troops. He wanted to assist them, but he only assisted them with military advisors. Johnson took the opposite approach, sent America's military in full force, obviously considering how messy a civil war can be. This had significant consequences, and he probably should have just stuck with the lesser approach like Kennedy. And in general, he was just very ambitious about domestic reform. Because of his skills in bipartisanship and his ambition, he was able to greatly expand the role of federal government in social policy during his presidency, which is pretty hard to do in just 2 terms. So another way, or one of the ways he did this, was civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was originally drafted by the Kennedy administration, officially signed into law by President Johnson. This protected voting rights in the South, desegregated public facilities, prohibited discrimination in hiring practices, and started the process to desegregate schools. It did leave a lot of loopholes, though, that the South was able to take advantage of, and so the Civil Rights Act of 1965 was also introduced, which prevented a lot of voter discrimination as well. So another big issue that was kind of noticed by Kennedy's administration, was kind of on the rise at this time, was elderly people's ability to pay for medical bills and just medical care in general. The chairman of the House and Ways Committee, Wilbur Mills, created a compromise that between conservatives and liberals that allowed Medicare and Medicaid programs to be more accessible. Obviously, this goes hand in hand with welfare, which conservatives aren't very in support of, but it was kind of obvious that this was a big issue with elderly people. Kennedy originally brought the issue to light, but he failed to attract both parties to the cause, and he failed to show how it could be beneficial to everyone. Johnson, obviously, his wanting to be more bipartisan, he put that to use and tried to appeal this legislation to conservatives. So obviously conservatives knew it was an issue, but they didn't want it to come out of their payroll, their taxes, or it to be mandatory. So the program was split into two parts. One, a mandatory payroll tax that funded elderly hospital services, and one funded physician services, but it was not a mandatory tax. It was monthly premiums on elderly, and it came from government revenue. So more federal aid was some aid to education in 1965. Johnson fashioned a compromise to Kennedy's proposal that led to the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So we're obviously seeing a lot of Johnson taking over stuff that Kennedy's administration was trying to start, but a lot of times never really got around to. He took on a lot, and he did well, but some of it was more than he could handle. So the Secondary Education Act provided federal assistance to public schools with high concentrations of low-income children, just made it easier for low-income children to do better in school. So hand in hand with this is the war on poverty. Kennedy, just before he died, started to realize the flaws in his domestic policy and the growing issue of poverty in certain communities, in certain places. It wasn't really a big focus of his campaign or of his presidency. The task of improving this domestic policy, again, was passed on to Johnson's administration, which turned it into what they call the war on poverty. So this included job training, youth employment, and medical services. A lot of it was done in community action programs. So it was these agencies that tried to combat poverty on a local scale, tried to provide help to communities in the best ways that they could. This quickly rose a lot of controversy. People didn't understand the responsibilities of these community agencies. People didn't want time, effort, and money to go into these agencies without real results being produced. It was soon obviously became clear that without actually being able to pull these communities out of poverty, the program isn't successful. So another way that we see welfare reform in the Johnson administration was a lot of these programs, such as the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. This one specifically gained a lot of attention in the 1960s, mainly from women trying to support their families and kind of learning that they had a right to this welfare and they had a right to actually be able to support their families. So the surge of women hoping to benefit from this was met with a lot of resentment from people who opposed welfare programs altogether, as well as people who believed women should stay home with their children. Doesn't really make sense because this would be aiding the children so the women could stay home. The people that were opposed to it actually demanded that women should join the workforce instead of receiving welfare. So they were more against welfare rather than wanting women to be able to stay home and take care of their children. Obviously, single mothers or just families that weren't making enough money could really benefit and actually survive off of welfare. But it's just not a conservative viewpoint. They would rather people join the workforce than expanding the federal government to help people so that people don't take advantage of it. So obviously conservatives and liberals were on opposite sides. Liberals wanted women to be able to receive these benefits without any job requirements. Conservatives kept trying to combat that, kept trying to throw in different literal requirements that would make it harder for women to receive this. After some trial and error, the legislation was able to kind of prevent conservatives from stopping these benefits. So overall, the liberals were successful, but a lot of the women did also actually want to work. So it was kind of just a lose-lose in some ways, but it was able to help a lot of people.
Food stamps in 1964 was a program that was enacted in the wake of a series of pilot feeding programs during the Kennedy administration. Families were allowed to purchase these food stamps or coupons for a price that was considerably lower than what their retail value was. A number of grocery stores across the country also agreed to take food stamps as payment. Families on welfare were automatically eligible, but many poor families that were not on welfare could also be certified by local welfare departments. Local shops and stores were also given the opportunity to participate in this program, which many of them did. Successive amendments in 1968, 1971, 1973, and 1978 dramatically expanded the funding for these programs. And this was a landmark achievement because it gave millions of families the resources to purchase food in quantities that were not possible with just the welfare checks alone that they were receiving. The oppression of vulnerable populations in the 1960s were the oppression of women, African Americans, Latinos, gay men, and lesbians, and even Native Americans were also ones to engage in policy advocacy. Women were widely perceived as fragile, and so these protective laws kept them from hard work. Other cultural factors also hindered them. They were required to be absent from the labor force for extended periods of time, whether that be for childbirth or just being in the home in general. Under pressure from the female activists, Kennedy actually appointed Esther Peterson as the director of the Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor, which was a huge win for women during this time. Gay men and lesbians. Underlying systematic homophobia was a combination of religious ideas, which equated homosexuality with sin, psychiatric and medical thought, which saw it as mental or physical pathology, and criminology, which was inclined to see homosexual behavior as criminal. Um, the gay and lesbian community began to develop organizations and leaderships in the 1950s, but these organizations lacked a mass membership and had little success in changing social policy. Um, the so-called Chicano movement signaled the beginning of the militant organizing projects that centered on Mexican Americans and undocumented workers. Also, with this, Native Americans had been placed on these reservations during the 19th century following the eviction from their ancestral land. The government agreed to provide certain commodities and services, such as schools, in return for the tribe's agreement to secede its ancestral land, and all of this went into some kind of social policy during the 1960s. Social work in the 1960s pretty much emerged from the Great Depression with the determination to upgrade the profession by making a bachelor's degree mandatory for admission to graduate programs and by making all graduate programs for the last 2 years. Casework remained the dominant methodology of the profession. The National Council of Social Work Education was established in 1964 to launch a study of social work education that would clarify relationships between undergraduate and graduate education. It was renamed the Council of Social Work Education, or otherwise known as CSWE, in 1952. Protests by students in various schools of social work in the 1960s and by activists at national conferences called for social workers to be more assertive in challenging existing programs and policies. The evolution of the reluctant welfare state, formidable legislative skills enabled Johnson to enact a flood of social legislation that greatly expanded the American welfare state during his presidency. Johnson added an array of social service, housing, job training, medical, legal aid, and nutritional programs, relatively few programs that had survived the New Deal previously. Roosevelt had also established the foundation of the American welfare state, while Johnson dramatically expanded its scope in a remarkably brief period compared. Considerable credit for the Great Society came from pressure from below, including the civil rights movement, the women's movement, beginning mobilization of people with disabilities,
Latinos, Native Americans, gays and lesbians, and other activist groups that kept pressure on legislation to keep peace and pace the reform. The Great Society to Contemporary Society. So the Vietnam War demonstrated that policy advocates do not have the luxury of focusing exclusively on domestic issues. If the nation had not plunged into this war, far greater resources would have been available for domestic policies, but they did. The Great Society illustrates, too, that huge tax cuts can often constrict resources needed for domestic reform. During the Great Society, three major additions were made to the American welfare state that are still integral parts of it now. One was civil rights legislation that contained key provisions with respect to persons of color and women, which we're still seeing today. Two, the myriad federal programs were enacted that were funded by the so-called discretionary budget and were also called categorical problems. And three, President Johnson secured the enactment for more than 150 programs funded by the discretionary budget.